The Willow Creek Tuesday in question was not merely hot. It was an oppressive, sweltering furnace blast of a day, the kind of heat that seemed to leach the very moisture from the air and bake the asphalt into a shimmering, heat-radiating griddle. The air hung thick and heavy, stagnant and unmoving, carrying with it the faint, acrid scent of melting tar and the drone of air conditioning units struggling valiantly, yet futilely, against the relentless thermal onslaught. Mirages danced and wavered on the distant horizon, blurring the sharp edges of buildings and turning the already congested streets into hazy, dreamlike ribbons of shimmering tarmac. Even the normally vibrant and bustling Willow Creek, a city known for its energetic pulse and restless momentum, seemed to have slowed to a languid crawl, its inhabitants seeking refuge in the cool, artificially chilled interiors of their homes and workplaces, venturing out only when absolutely necessary, and even then with a palpable sense of weary resignation. Chief Michael Thompson, a man whose very existence was intertwined with the ebb and flow of Willow Creek's circulatory system, its traffic, felt the heat particularly acutely. Not just physically, though the sweat beaded on his brow and dampened the collar of his crisp, perpetually creased traffic chief uniform, but professionally as well. The relentless heat seemed to exacerbate the city's already simmering traffic woes. Tempers flared as easily as gasoline vapors in the scorching air, and the usual minor fender benders and parking disputes were escalating into full-blown road rage incidents with alarming frequency. His morning had already been a maelstrom of frantic calls, citizen complaints about malfunctioning traffic lights melting under the sun's intensity, and a particularly heated debate with a construction crew adamant about extending their road closure despite its catastrophic impact on rush hour flow. He longed, quite desperately, for a moment of respite, a brief interlude of normalcy amidst the chaos. His current mission, ostensibly simple, was to procure a box of assorted pastries from the Daily Crumb, Willow Creek's artisanal bakery and a local institution renowned for its melt-in-your-mouth croissants, decadent eclairs, and an assortment of other sugary confections that were, in Chief Thompson's personal and professional opinion, essential diplomatic tools. He was facing a particularly contentious city council meeting that afternoon, a budgetary showdown where his proposed traffic management overhaul, years in the making and desperately needed to modernize Willow Creek's antiquated road network, was facing stiff opposition from council members clinging stubbornly to outdated infrastructure and even more outdated ideas about urban planning. He knew from experience that a strategically deployed box of the Daily Crumb's finest could soften even the most hardened bureaucratic hearts and lubricate the wheels of negotiation, transforming potentially acrimonious debate into at least marginally more civil discourse. The Daily Crumb, however, presented its own unique set of challenges, particularly when it came to parking. Nestled in the heart of Willow Creek's historic district, a charming labyrinth of narrow cobblestone streets and beautifully preserved Victorian-era buildings, parking in the vicinity was, on a good day, a frustrating exercise in patience and spatial awareness. On a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, in the midst of a city-wide heatwave, it was akin to navigating a minefield blindfolded. The few designated parking spaces were perpetually occupied, fiercely contested, and often illegally double-parked around, creating a chaotic ballet of honking horns and frustrated drivers circling endlessly like predatory sharks in a concrete ocean. Chief Thompson, armed with years of navigating Willow Creek's Byzantine traffic arteries and possessing an almost preternatural sense for finding overlooked shortcuts and hidden routes, embarked on his parking quest with a sigh of practiced resignation. He piloted his official though intentionally discreet city vehicle, a modest charcoal gray sedan that blended seamlessly into the urban landscape, devoid of flashing lights or overt official markings, down the narrow streets surrounding the Daily Crumb, his eyes scanning the asphalt jungle with the hawk-like focus of a seasoned parking veteran. He circled the block once, twice, the heat intensifying with each rotation, the air inside his car, even with the air conditioning at full blast, feeling thick and stifling. Each seemingly promising gap in the parked cars turned out to be either too small, blocked by a strategically placed delivery truck, or, in one particularly frustrating instance, revealed to be a deceptively painted patch of red curb cleverly disguised by years of accumulated grime and fading paint. Just as his internal reserves of patience began to dwindle, and the prospect of resorting to illegally parking in a loading zone started to flicker tantalizingly in his mind, he spotted it, a space. Not a perfect space, certainly a bit snug, bordering on compact, but undeniably a space, blessedly legal-looking and crucially located tantalizingly close to the Daily Crumb's inviting air-conditioned doorway. It was situated adjacent to a fire hydrant, painted in a rather garish shade of sunflower yellow, a vibrant beacon in the otherwise muted tones of the streetscape. The proximity to the hydrant did give him a momentary pause, a flicker of professional unease. He was, after all, the chief of traffic, the very embodiment of Willow Creek's parking regulations. The irony of receiving a parking ticket himself was not lost on him. However, after a quick, practiced assessment, honed by years of observing parking violations both egregious and subtle, he deemed the space legally and practically viable. There was, he calculated, a more than sufficient buffer zone between his vehicle and the hydrant itself. He could park there, neatly within the painted lines, without even remotely obstructing access to the vital piece of firefighting infrastructure. He trusted his judgment, honed by years of experience and a deeply ingrained understanding of spatial dynamics. With a practiced ease born of countless parallel parking maneuvers in far tighter spots, he expertly slotted his sedan into the space, the tires bumping gently against the curb, the car settling neatly within the designated white lines. He double-checked his positioning, just to be absolutely certain, peering out of his side window to confirm the clear and unobstructed access to the cheerfully yellow hydrant. Satisfied with his parking prowess and the legality of his maneuver, he switched off the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the oppressive heat pressing in from the outside world. As he emerged from his car, the heat hitting him like a physical wall, the jingle of his keys in his hand a small mundane sound in the sweltering afternoon quiet, a figure materialized seemingly out of thin air, a woman radiating an aura of incandescent fury that seemed to physically distort the already heat-warped air around her. She appeared as if conjured by the very asphalt itself, a manifestation of the city's simmering parking frustrations, brought to life by the oppressive heat and Chief Thompson's perceived parking transgression. This was Karen. The name, uttered in Willow Creek's local businesses and online community forums, carried with it a weight of shared exasperation, a collective shudder of recognition. Karen was, in local parlance, a legendary Karen, a specimen of the species so perfectly embodying the archetype that she had achieved near-mythical status. Her unwavering belief in her own absolute correctness, her almost preternatural ability to find fault in even the most innocuous situations, and her uncanny talent for escalating minor inconveniences into operatic neighborhood dramas were the stuff of local lore. She was, to put it mildly, known. Her eyes, fixed on Chief Thompson's parked car with the unwavering intensity of a laser beam locked onto its target, narrowed to slits, conveying a level of indignation that could curdle milk at 50 paces. She approached with a purposeful stride, her posture ramrod straight, her arms swinging stiffly at her sides, her entire being radiating an almost palpable sense of righteous outrage. Her gaze, when it finally shifted from the offending vehicle to Chief Thompson himself, was glacial, devoid of warmth, conveying a silent accusation of personal affront, as if his mere act of parking near her perceived territory was a deliberate and malicious act of disrespect aimed directly at her person. She hadn't even registered his presence as a human being, an individual. To her, he was merely an extension of the offending vehicle, an appendage of the parking violation itself. Before Chief Thompson, still adjusting to the transition from air-conditioned car to blast furnace street, could even offer a polite greeting, a placatory gesture, or a preemptive explanation, Karen unleashed her verbal assault. Her voice, initially pitched at a deceptively normal conversational level, rapidly escalated in volume and intensity with each accusatory syllable, rising to a shrill, penetrating crescendo that seemed to vibrate the very air molecules around them. It was a voice honed by years of practice, perfectly calibrated to project indignation and righteous anger, a weaponized vocal instrument designed to intimidate and overwhelm. Are you seriously parked there?" she began, the words dripping with incredulity and barely suppressed fury. It wasn't a question, it was a declarative statement disguised as rhetorical outrage, demanding not information, but immediate and abject contrition. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This is unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable." Her tirade continued, a torrent of accusations and pronouncements delivered with theatrical flourishes and dramatic hand gestures. She accused him of blatant disregard for parking regulations, of selfish entitlement, of a shocking lack of consideration for others, and of course of the cardinal sin of parking so close to the fire hydrant, despite the clearly visible and perfectly adequate space separating his car from the bright yellow paint. She punctuated her escalating monologue with sharp, stabbing finger points towards the hydrant, then back at his car, then accusingly at him, each gesture a visual exclamation point emphasizing the gravity of his perceived transgression. "You're practically on top of that hydrant," she shrieked, her voice cracking slightly with the sheer force of her indignation. "Do you even care about public safety? What if there's a fire? What if the fire department needs to get to this hydrant? Because of you, because of your selfish, illegal parking, people could die. Are you happy with that? Are you? She didn't pause for an answer, didn't expect one. Her tirade was not an invitation to dialogue. It was a performance, a one-woman show of righteous fury directed squarely at Chief Thompson and his hapless vehicle. She brandished her smartphone like a weapon, holding it aloft as if it were Excalibur itself, threatening him with the digital sword of social media shaming and the full might of law enforcement. I am taking pictures, she declared, snapping a flurry of digital images with performative aggression, the click of the phone camera echoing in the sweltering air like the cocking of a pistol. I am reporting you. I am calling the police. This is going straight to the authorities. You can just wait right here and explain yourself to the officer when they arrive. You are going to be in so much trouble. Her voice dripped with vindictive glee at the prospect of his imminent punishment, the imagined arrival of law enforcement a dramatic climax she clearly relished. She was, in her mind, the righteous citizen, upholding the law, protecting public safety, and delivering swift and merciless justice to the parking scofflaw who dared to park near her perceived territory. She was completely, utterly, blissfully oblivious to the fact that she was not only addressing the chief of traffic for Willow Creek, the very architect of the city's parking regulations, but also, and perhaps more importantly, a man who was, at that very moment, desperately in need of a box of pastries and simply trying to start his afternoon without a needless and thoroughly ridiculous confrontation. Chief Thompson, initially stunned into momentary silence by the sheer vehemence and irrationality of Karen's outburst, maintained a remarkable, almost superhuman level of composure. Years of mediating road rage incidents, defusing bureaucratic standoffs, and navigating the labyrinthine world of city politics had forged within him a bedrock of unflappable calm, a practiced serenity in the face of chaos. He watched and listened, allowing Karen to vent her spleen, his expression remaining placid, his body language non-threatening, his hands open and empty, projecting an aura of patience and non-aggression. He knew from long and often painful experience that attempting to interrupt the legendary Karen mid-tirade was akin to throwing gasoline on a bonfire. It was best to let the initial conflagration burn itself out, to wait for a momentary lull, a brief pause in the verbal assault, to insert a calm and measured response. He was waiting for that tiny crack in the wall of righteous fury, that fleeting opportunity to interject, to introduce himself, and with a carefully calibrated blend of professional authority and disarming politeness, to gently, diplomatically, and hopefully de-escalate the escalating parking space predicament before it spiraled into a full-blown, pastry-delaying, and entirely unnecessary public spectacle. Karen, having delivered her ultimatum with the dramatic flourish of a seasoned stage performer, stood panting slightly, her chest heaving with righteous indignation, her eyes still blazing with unwavering certainty of her own moral and legal superiority. She held her smartphone aloft, the digital embodiment of her power, as if expecting Chief Thompson to instantly crumble under the weight of her threatened civic action. A tense silence descended, broken only by the distant drone of city traffic and the persistent hum of air conditioning units laboring against the oppressive heat. Karen seemed to be waiting, poised and expectant, for some sign of capitulation, a desperate plea for leniency, perhaps even a tearful apology for the egregious parking offense she had so vividly imagined. Chief Thompson, however, remained steadfastly composed. He had witnessed this performance countless times before, variations of the same script played out on countless street corners, in countless parking lots, across the sprawling urban stage of Willow Creek. He recognized the patterns, the predictable escalation, the underlying insecurity masked by aggressive self-righteousness. He knew that direct confrontation at this juncture would be futile, even counterproductive, likely to further inflame Karen's already volatile emotions and escalate the situation into a full-blown public spectacle, drawing unwanted attention and further delaying his already time-sensitive pastry procurement mission. He decided to employ a strategy of gentle deflection, a carefully calibrated approach designed to subtly puncture the bubble of Karen's self-importance and introduce a note of calm rationality into the escalating drama. He began by offering a placating smile, a non-threatening gesture intended to diffuse the immediate tension. It was not a wide, toothy grin, which might be misconstrued as mockery, but a small, controlled upturn of the lips, a subtle signal of non-hostility and a willingness to engage in a more reasonable exchange. "Ma'am," he began, his voice calm and even, projecting an air of quiet authority honed over years of commanding respect without resorting to aggression. He consciously kept his tone neutral, devoid of any hint of defensiveness or sarcasm, aiming for a tone that was both respectful and subtly assertive. "I understand your concern about the parking, near the hydrant." He deliberately echoed her phrasing, acknowledging her perceived grievance without necessarily validating its accuracy. "And I want to assure you, I have taken great care to ensure that my vehicle is not obstructing it in any way." He paused, allowing his words to sink in, giving Karen a moment to process his measured response, hoping to interrupt the relentless momentum of her pre-programmed tirade. He then gestured calmly towards his car, indicating the space between his bumper and the brightly painted hydrant. "If you take a closer look, you'll see there's ample clearance. The fire department would have no problem accessing the hydrant if they needed to." He avoided directly refuting her accusations, choosing instead to gently redirect her attention to the observable reality of the situation, appealing to logic and visual evidence rather than engaging in a direct verbal sparring match. He was, in essence, attempting to gently guide her back from the precipice of hysterical outrage towards a semblance of rational discourse. Karen, however, remained unmoved. Her face hardened, her eyes narrowing further, as if his attempt at reasoned explanation was itself another form of personal insult, a further demonstration of his egregious disregard for her pronouncements. The placating smile, the calm tone, the gentle explanation, all seemed to bounce harmlessly off the impenetrable wall of her self-righteousness. "Don't you ma'am me," she snapped, her voice rising in volume and pitch once more, the brief lull in her tirade proving to be just a momentary pause for breath, a mere refueling stop in her engine of indignation. "And don't you try to tell me what I can and can't see. I can see perfectly well that you are parked illegally. You are too close to the hydrant. It's obvious. Anyone can see it. Except apparently you, in your selfish little world where the rules don't apply to you." She doubled down on her accusations, her rhetoric escalating, her initial complaint about hydrant proximity now morphing into a broader indictment of his character, his supposed entitlement, and his presumed disregard for the law. The parking space had become less about actual obstruction and more about a symbolic battleground, a stage upon which Karen could play out her self-appointed role as the righteous enforcer of civic order, battling against the perceived forces of anarchy and lawlessness represented by Chief Thompson's parked sedan. "I am calling the police," she declared again, this time with even greater vehemence, punctuating each word with a sharp, decisive nod of her head, as if to emphasize the finality of her decision. "And when they get here you'll be singing a different tune. You'll see. You'll be begging for mercy." She actually seemed to relish the prospect of his supposed humiliation, the imagined scene of him being confronted by law enforcement, forced to admit his wrongdoing in the face of her righteous indignation. And with that, she turned her back on Chief Thompson, with a dramatic swivel of her heel that spoke volumes of her dismissive contempt, and began to furiously tap on her smartphone screen, presumably summoning the forces of law in order to descend upon the scene of his perceived parking crime. She marched a few paces away, still muttering under her breath, her back ramrod straight, maintaining the posture of aggrieved righteousness even as she distanced herself physically from her perceived adversary. Chief Thompson sighed inwardly. He had hoped to avoid this escalation, to de-escalate the situation before it reached this point, but it seemed that reasoned discourse was simply not in Karen's repertoire. He watched her retreat, phone clutched tightly in her hand, a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head betraying a flicker of weary resignation. He knew that once a legendary Karen had decided to summon the authorities, there was often no turning back. The wheels of escalation were now in motion, set to grind inexorably forward, regardless of logic, reason, or empirical evidence. He considered his options. He could simply leave, abandon his pastry mission, and return to the escalating chaos of his traffic management duties. But that felt wrong. It would be a tacit admission of guilt, a retreat in the face of baseless accusations. And besides, he really did need those pastries for the city council meeting. Diplomacy, after all, often relied on the strategic deployment of sugar. And he was, after all, the chief of traffic. He had a certain civic responsibility to uphold the law, even when he was the one being falsely accused of violating it. So he decided to stay. He would wait for the police to arrive, calmly explain the situation, present his side of the story, and if necessary reveal his professional identity. He had no doubt that once the responding officer understood the reality of the situation, the matter would be quickly resolved. It was, after all, a ludicrous overreaction to a perfectly legal parking maneuver. He reached into his pocket and retrieved his own smartphone, intending to call his office, perhaps alert them to the situation, just in case things did somehow escalate further. But before he could even unlock his screen, he heard the distinct, unmistakable wail of a police siren approaching in the distance, growing rapidly louder, closer, its piercing sound cutting through the oppressive heat and the low hum of city noise. He glanced in the direction of the approaching siren, a flicker of mild surprise crossing his face. That was remarkably fast. Willow Creek's police response times were usually less than instantaneous, especially for what was essentially a non-emergency parking dispute. He wondered if Karen had perhaps embellished the situation slightly in her call to 911, perhaps painting a picture of a far more dramatic and urgent scenario than a simple disagreement over parking proximity to a fire hydrant. The siren grew deafeningly loud, and then with a squeal of tires and a rush of air, a Willow Creek Police Department cruiser rounded the corner and pulled up directly behind Chief Thompson's parked sedan, its flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the surrounding buildings, casting strobing patterns of light and shadow across the already shimmering asphalt. A uniformed police officer emerged from the cruiser, unfolding himself from the driver's seat with a practiced efficiency, adjusting his uniform belt and squaring his shoulders as he approached. He was a young officer, probably in his early 20s, with a fresh-faced earnestness that was slightly at odds with the seasoned cynicism often found in veteran law enforcement personnel. He had a clipboard in hand and an expression that suggested he was expecting to deal with a fairly routine, if perhaps slightly agitated, parking violation. He approached Karen first, who immediately rushed towards him, phone still clutched in her hand, her face alight with self-satisfied triumph, clearly eager to present her case, to narrate her version of events, to bask in the anticipated validation of her righteous indignation by a uniformed representative of the law. Chief Thompson watched the interaction unfold, a mixture of amusement and mild exasperation swirling within him. He remained standing calmly beside his car, leaning slightly against the driver's side door, his hands loosely clasped in front of him, projecting an air of quiet confidence and patient anticipation. He knew that the truth would eventually come out. He just hoped it wouldn't take too long, as those pastries were not going to deliver themselves, and the city council meeting was rapidly approaching. He glanced again at the police officer, who was now listening intently to Karen, nodding occasionally, his expression still largely neutral, giving no immediate indication of whose side he was inclined to take in this unfolding parking space drama. The irony of the situation was not lost on Chief Thompson. He, the chief of traffic, the architect of Willow Creek's parking regulations, was now standing accused of a parking violation, about to be judged by a young police officer, all at the behest of a woman whose sense of entitlement seemed to know no bounds, all because of a perceived slight in the crucible of a sweltering Tuesday afternoon and the battle for a coveted parking space near the Daily Crumb. The absurdity of it all was almost comical. Almost. If it weren't for the pastries and the impending city council meeting, he might have even found the situation genuinely amusing. As it was, he simply waited patiently for the next act in this unfolding and increasingly ironic drama to begin. Officer Miller, young and earnest as he was, listened attentively to Karen's impassioned narrative, his expression remaining carefully neutral, a mask of professional impartiality. He diligently scribbled notes on his clipboard, occasionally glancing from Karen to Chief Thompson's car, and then back to Karen again, piecing together the fragmented and highly subjective account of the parking infraction. Karen, emboldened by the presence of law enforcement, gestured dramatically, pointing out the perceived proximity of Chief Thompson's vehicle to the fire hydrant, reiterating her accusations of blatant disregard for public safety, and emphasizing the sheer audacity of his parking maneuver, all while casting frequent triumphant glances in Chief Thompson's direction, as if expecting him to be visibly wilting under the weight of her accusations and the impending judgment of the law. Officer Miller, trained to handle a wide spectrum of citizen disputes ranging from domestic disturbances to petty theft, and even the occasional rogue squirrel wreaking havoc in a local bakery, a surprisingly frequent Willow Creek occurrence, recognized the familiar contours of a parking Karen situation almost immediately. He had encountered variations of this scenario countless times during his relatively short tenure on the Willow Creek police force. He understood the underlying dynamics, the inflated sense of entitlement, the desire for validation, the almost performative outrage over seemingly minor infractions. He knew that these situations required a delicate balance of firmness and diplomacy, a careful navigation between upholding the law and defusing unnecessary conflict. Once Karen had finally concluded her impassioned presentation of evidence, punctuated by a final accusatory glare directed at Chief Thompson, Officer Miller turned his attention to the chief. He approached Chief Thompson with a polite, professional demeanor, clipboard in hand, his expression still carefully neutral, giving no indication of prejudgment. "Sir," Officer Miller began, his tone respectful and even. I understand there's been a disagreement regarding parking? He phrased it as a neutral inquiry, avoiding any language that might presuppose guilt or innocence, simply seeking to gather information from the other party involved. Chief Thompson, maintaining his calm and composed demeanor, nodded slowly. Officer, he replied, his voice still even and measured, yes, there has. This, madam here, he gestured subtly towards Karen without making direct eye contact, believes I am parked illegally and obstructing access to the fire hydrant. Officer Miller glanced back at Karen, who nodded vigorously in affirmation, her eyes still fixed on Chief Thompson with a mixture of suspicion and triumphant anticipation. And is that your understanding of the situation, sir? Officer Miller asked, turning his attention back to Chief Thompson, giving him the opportunity to present his perspective. Chief Thompson paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. He could have immediately pulled rank, flashed his badge, and instantly shut down the entire situation with a single-sentence declaration of his authority. But that felt uncivil, unnecessary, and perhaps even a little unsporting. He preferred a more subtle approach, a gentle unveiling of the ironic reality of the situation. Officer, Chief Thompson began again, his voice still calm and measured, with all due respect to the madam's concerns. He paused again, allowing a hint of wry amusement to flicker across his lips. I can assure you that my vehicle is parked legally, safely, and in full compliance with all Willow Creek parking ordinances. Furthermore, he paused again, allowing the slightest emphasis to fall on his next words. As a matter of fact, ensuring compliance with those very ordinances is, well, part of my job description. Officer Miller's eyebrows raised slightly, a flicker of curiosity crossing his otherwise neutral expression. He was clearly intrigued by Chief Thompson's carefully worded statement, the subtle emphasis, the hint of something more beneath the surface of the seemingly mundane parking dispute. And, what exactly is your occupation, sir? Officer Miller inquired, his tone now laced with a touch of polite curiosity, his pen poised above his clipboard, ready to record the answer. Chief Thompson finally allowed a small, genuine smile to spread across his face. It was not a boastful grin but a gentle, almost apologetic smile, a signal of understanding and a prelude to the unveiling of the situation's inherent irony. He reached into his inside jacket pocket, slowly and deliberately, and produced his official Willow Creek Chief of Traffic badge, its polished metal gleaming faintly in the afternoon sun. He held it out for Officer Miller to see, the badge catching the light and reflecting it back in a silent, yet undeniably authoritative flash. Officer, Chief Thompson said, his voice still calm, but now with a hint of undeniable authority, Michael Thompson. Chief of Traffic, Willow Creek. The effect was immediate. Officer Miller's eyes widened just perceptibly as he took in the badge, his gaze flicking from the gleaming metal to Chief Thompson's face, and back to the badge again, rapidly recalibrating his understanding of the entire situation. The neutral expression melted away, replaced by a mixture of surprise, dawning comprehension, and a rapidly developing sense of sheepishness. Karen, who had been standing nearby, still radiating self-righteous indignation and basking in the imagined triumph of her citizen's arrest, seemed to deflate visibly. Her triumphant expression faltered, her eyes widening in dawning comprehension as she, too, finally registered the import of Chief Thompson's words and the significance of the badge now prominently displayed. The air of self-assured certainty began to dissipate, replaced by a palpable sense of unease. The triumphant glow in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a flicker of something akin to panic. Officer Miller, recovering quickly from his initial surprise, snapped to a more formal posture, his demeanor shifting from polite neutrality to respectful deference in a matter of seconds. He straightened his back, tucked his clipboard under his arm with a more decisive movement, and addressed Chief Thompson with a noticeably more formal tone. Chief Thompson, Officer Miller said, his voice now carrying a distinct note of respect, almost bordering on apology. My apologies, sir. I was unaware. He trailed off, slightly flustered, clearly realizing the rather unique nature of the situation he had just stumbled into. He glanced back at Karen, his expression now shifting from neutral to, well, perhaps just a touch, less sympathetic. The clipboard, which had been poised to diligently record Karen's every accusation, now seemed to hang a little limply in his hand. Ma'am, Officer Miller said, turning to Karen, his tone now noticeably cooler, less encouraging than it had been moments before. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. This gentleman is Chief Thompson, the Chief of Traffic for Willow Creek. Karen stared at Officer Miller, then back at Chief Thompson, then back at Officer Miller again, her face slowly draining of color, the triumphant flush of righteous indignation fading rapidly, replaced by a pallid complexion and an expression of dawning horror. The reality of the situation seemed to be crashing down upon her with the force of a physical blow. She had not just confronted a parking scofflaw, she had accosted, berated, and attempted to have arrested the chief of traffic for parking legally. The sheer, monumental irony of it all seemed to be short-circuiting her cognitive processing abilities. Chief of traffic? Karen stammered, her voice barely a whisper, her previously assertive tone completely vanished, replaced by a weak, almost pleading uncertainty. The words seemed to catch in her throat, as if she couldn't quite comprehend the reality of what she was hearing. Chief Thompson, sensing her dawning realization and the rapidly escalating tide of her embarrassment, decided to take a more conciliatory approach. He had no desire to publicly humiliate her, to press his advantage, or to prolong the already absurd situation. He just wanted to get his pastries and get to his meeting. He extended his hand towards Officer Miller, offering a gesture of amicable closure. "Officer Miller," Chief Thompson said, his voice now warm and reassuring. "No harm done. I understand you were just responding to a citizen's call. You were doing your job. Thank you for your prompt response." He deliberately downplayed the entire incident, treating it as a minor, easily resolved misunderstanding. Officer Miller gratefully accepted the handshake, a visible wave of relief washing over his face. "Chief Thompson," he replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Thank you, sir. And again my apologies for the misunderstanding." Chief Thompson then turned his attention to Karen, who was still standing frozen, her face a mask of mortified disbelief. He offered her a small, gentle smile, a gesture of forgiveness and understanding. "Ma'am," Chief Thompson said, his voice now gentle and almost kindly. Perhaps we all just got a little overheated in this lovely weather. No harm done. Just a simple misunderstanding. These things happen." He deliberately used inclusive language, subtly sharing the blame, downplaying her singular role in escalating the situation. Karen, still visibly shaken, managed a weak, wavering nod. Her voice remained a barely audible whisper. Misunderstanding," she echoed, the word catching in her throat again, as if she was still struggling to fully process the reality of her colossal misjudgment. Chief Thompson, sensing that the situation had been sufficiently defused, and that Karen had likely learned a valuable, if somewhat publicly embarrassing, lesson about the perils of unchecked entitlement and the importance of verifying facts before launching into accusatory tirades, decided to bring the entire episode to a graceful close. He turned towards the Daily Crumb, gesturing towards its inviting air-conditioned doorway. "Well," Chief Thompson said, his voice now regaining its usual cheerful tone. "Pastries are calling. Duty calls even on a Tuesday afternoon. Officer Miller, thank you again." "Ma'am," he offered Karen another small, reassuring smile, "have a pleasant afternoon. And perhaps, next time, before calling the authorities, maybe just take a closer look?" And with that, Chief Thompson turned and walked towards the Daily Crumb, leaving Officer Miller and a thoroughly deflated and utterly humiliated Karen standing in the shimmering heat of the Willow Creek afternoon, the echoes of sirens fading into the background, replaced by the distant but increasingly enticing aroma of freshly baked pastries. He entered the cool, fragrant haven of the bakery, the bell above the door jingling merrily, a small, almost unnoticed smile playing on his lips. He knew he had a good story to tell at the city council meeting, perhaps even a story that could be strategically deployed to lighten the mood and further facilitate the diplomatic deployment of his soon-to-be-acquired box of assorted delicacies. As for Karen, well, he suspected that her future parking enforcement activities might be conducted with just a touch more caution. And perhaps, just perhaps, she might even learn to appreciate the subtle and often ironic humor of life in Willow Creek, a city where even a simple trip for pastries could turn into an unexpected and thoroughly entertaining encounter with an legendary Karen, and the wonderfully ironic twist of fate that made the chief of traffic the target of a parking complaint. And all, ultimately, ending with the sweet, comforting aroma of freshly baked goods and the subtle, satisfying taste of justice, or at least, a very large box of assorted pastries.